Welcome to the Manga Bay Newscast. I'm your host, Mike DiGirolamo, bringing you the news and inspiration from nature's front line. Joining us this week is Tom Philpott, a senior research associate at the Center for a Livable Future at Johns Hopkins University and former food journalist and reporter at Mother Jones and Grist. He joins us to discuss the subject of his 2020 book, Perilous Bounty, the looming collapse of American farming and how we can prevent it. Tom talks about the problems facing U.S. food systems and how these relate to global ones. We talk about the sustainable farming practice based on traditional techniques, agroecology, and a subset of this, agroforestry, and why Tom has hope that these practices can help address our food system challenges. Additionally, Tom discusses the context of colonialism on food and agriculture and how movements such as the Land Back movement and Black agrarianism signal a positive change. Well, first of all, thank you so much for joining me today. It's a pleasure to have you on the Manga Bay Newscast.
Great to be here.
So you've had lots of experience as a food journalist for Mother Jones and for Grist. I'm curious, what got you interested in journalism and also food, and then also the sustainability of agriculture?
Wow, big question. I think for me, getting into journalism was something that I got into really early in life. I worked in the school newspaper in high school, and just I kind of grew up in this. It's a little kid in the '70s in the wake of Watergate, and I think the romance of investigative journalism obviously had a big moment at that time. Kind of caught me a little bit, so it was something I was always interested in. And then with regard to food, I think I came to it, first of all, out of an appreciation for food itself. I just, at an early age, I developed a strong taste in delicious things, even though I, grew up in that typical '70s household with lots of convenience foods. My mom would occasionally cook a major meal from a cookbook. And those experiences are really vivid to me. And so I took an interest, and I worked in restaurants in high school and college, and was serious about politics and sort of a critique of, existing political structures, and got serious about food. And at a certain point in the '90s, these two interests emerged, and I, got interested in writing about food politics.
And then so eventually you started examining agriculture, and particularly in your new book, which is called Perilous Bounty, the looming collapse of American farming and how we can prevent it. Can you talk about some of the problems with food production systems in the United States that you highlight in this book?
Yeah, so starting around the mid 2000s, I became the sort of food editor and food and ag editor for Grist magazine. And so it's a national publication, so I had a national beat. And when you have a national beat on food and agriculture, there are really two areas that keep drawing your attention. And that is California, which is the source of, the great bulk of the fruits and vegetables that we have access to in this country. And then the other one being the Corn Belt, which is the source of the corn and soybeans that really kind of props up our meat production system. And so from early on in my career covering food politics, I got really interested in those two places. And at a certain point in the probably early 2010s, I started to realize that things were a lot worse in both of these places than most people thought. That the ecologies of these places that are very unique on the global stage of sort of look at global food production assets. California and the Corn Belt centered in Iowa both stand out as these really important places. And I had this realization that both of these places were in a state of ecological unraveling that I think a lot of people, even who really followed agriculture, thought there might be some temporary fluctuations like California's drought or, a drought or, a particularly stormy season in the Midwest, and there would be these problems. But while there might be ecological problems, they were both sort of lurching along just fine. And what I realized was that both of them are, not doing well at all, and are in the process of undermining the very ecological assets that prop them up. And so something has to give there, is what I realized. And that was really the impetus for writing the book. And I think the U.S. has a lot of regions where industrial agriculture really abuses the land and abuses people. Not just California and the Corn Belt. There's Eastern North Carolina, where I was just on a reporting trip, where the hog industry is doing terrible things. There's Florida, which has just this system of agriculture that ruthlessly exploits immigrant farm workers and is just treating the land like a sacrifice zone. There are lots of other places to write about, but these two regions are really sort of the fulcrums on which our food system rests, and the fact that both of them are unraveling, I thought needed a lot more attention. So that was my impetus.
And then let's focus in a little bit on what are some of the top problems then with these specific regions. What exactly is the main issues with the way food is produced in them?
Yeah, so in California, what has happened is that since U.S. settlement, so it becomes part of the United States in the 1850s, and really before that, when it was under Spanish rule, the main agricultural regions didn't get a lot of attention from the Spanish. Like the Central Valley, the Spanish didn't really do much there or pay much attention to it. So it's this big valley that is sort of is like the spine in the center of the state, going north south, and it's responsible for a huge amount of our food production. And under U.S. settlement, we have really turned it into this incredibly productive center for the production of fruits, vegetables, nuts, milk. There's a lot of milk production in the southern part of the valley. And exploited these pretty considerable water resources that had been, before settlement. What you have is the Sierra Nevada mountains capture snow in the winter and release it as snow melt in the spring. And we're seeing this giant snowpack this year happening there. And so, forever, the water has just sort of gushed down in these rivers, and there's been these incredibly productive ecosystems. There were Native Americans living there and really thriving. So it's got a sort of a Mediterranean climate, meaning that it's long, hot summers that are pretty dry, and winters where you get some rain, but really mostly snow up in the Sierra Nevada. And so since settlement, what has happened is that we have taken control of that water. We've diverted it into dams and canals and reservoirs and things like that. Those rivers basically don't run free anymore. We dried up the biggest lake west of the Mississippi called Tulare Lake, which is now in the process of refilling because of winter storms. And created this massive agricultural industry. But what has happened is that in the course of this time, over these decades, the industry has gotten so big and so ravenous for water that it's essentially using more water than this system can provide. And in the meantime, we've seen climate change greatly reduce the average amount of snowpack. The average amount of snowpack has dropped considerably since the turn of the century, turn of the 20s into the 21st century. We see increasing drought patterns, and so what farmers do when the snowpack doesn't come, as it doesn't come in these drought years, is that they tap underground water reservoirs, these underground water aquifers that really kind of should be this thing that you tap very judiciously because it's essentially a fossil resource. Well, they've essentially stuck straws in there and just sucked it dry. The land is sinking. Essentially agriculture has gotten way bigger than these declining water resources can handle. And what we're seeing is a race to the bottom of the aquifer. And years like what we're seeing right now, this incredibly wet winter, don't make up for the drought years. And we can also talk about the possibility of a great flood, which we're possibly seeing play out right now. And so what we're doing there is we're drawing down the fossil resource of these aquifers and meanwhile polluting it with agrochemicals. So it's increasingly full of things like nitrates and pesticides. And also as it gets closer and closer to the, lower and lower in the aquifer, you get naturally occurring toxins like arsenic. And so we've taken this resource, we've greatly depleted it and essentially poisoned it. And that's where we are now. And a couple of, big winter storms like the current one that we're having now is not going to be enough to offset this. We are in a race to the bottom of the aquifer in California. And then if we shift to the Midwest, what we're looking at there is the situation where we grow two crops every year, corn and soybeans, that are, the sort of basis of the meat industry. And not just in the US, we export a significant amount of corn and soybeans, and they prop up industrial meat production in Mexico and in China and in other places. And it looks like it is this incredibly productive system. The yields that they're managing to get out of the ground there are incredible. But there's a problem, it turns out, when you grow the same two crops on land at the same time every year, and that they're planted at the same time and harvested at the same time. And that is that you leave the ground bare in the off season, which is, let's say, November until the kind of canopy of the plants come up, let's say June. And in those intervening months, what we're seeing is increasingly fierce storms driven by climate change are coming in and hitting that land and causing soil erosion that is on a grand scale, and we've already seen, according to satellite imagery that is this researchers at the University of Massachusetts have come out with research showing that a third of the Corn Belt has already seen its entire layer of topsoil eroded away, and this is happening. I show in the book. It's happening at a rate of about 16 times the rate of natural replenishment of soil. Probably a lot of people listening to this podcast know that soil regenerates itself based on weathering of underground rock. And it's at a very slow pace, but it generates at a very slow pace. And if you use it wrong, you can deplete it at a very rapid pace, and you go out of balance. And we're losing topsoil there very, very rapidly. And when it's gone, this region will no longer be this highly productive region. So once again, whereas in California, Central Valley, we're in a race to the bottom of the aquifer, in the Corn Belt, we're in a race to the bottom of the soil profile. And no one wins either of these races in the end.
That's really, really interesting to hear. I was actually curious to get your comment on something, and I was surprised myself to hear this. Well, perhaps I wasn't surprised is not the right word. I was really interested to hear that despite the sort of steady growth of the population in the U.S., it seems like agribusiness is trying to incentivize more consumption of food that the U.S. population doesn't necessarily want or need. And I was wondering if you could talk about how this seems to be sort of exacerbating the problem.
Yeah, this is a great topic. So the U.S. population is growing at a pretty slow pace. I don't have the exact figure, but let's say 1 or 2% a year, and I think it's mostly immigration is causing any population growth is it's just a very slow growth rate. But if you're a multinational company that's publicly traded, then you've got to show profit growth every quarter, ideally. And so if you're looking at if you're a meat company, let's say you're Tyson, which is, I believe, the biggest meat company in the world, maybe JBS is, but it's one of the two biggest meat companies in the world. It's an American-based company. If you're and they have dominant positions in pork, beef, and chicken, the big three U.S. proteins. If you go to your shareholders and say that, people meat consumption, per capita meat consumption is basically leveled off. Maybe it grows a percent or two a year, or drops a percent or two a year, but it's basically leveled off. Population is pretty close to leveled off. We're not going to see a lot of growth in the domestic market. Sorry, guys. We're at this steady state. Don't expect much growth. Maybe we'll come out with some new products and get a little bit of growth on the edges, but it's not looking so good. Their stock is going to plunge. It's going to, there's going to be this, capital flight from this company. So what do? They say, well, actually, our U.S. dominance is very profitable and will sort of underpin our company, but we're going to grow in foreign markets. We're going to export food to China, other parts of Asia, to Europe, to South America. And so what happens is that even though Americans meat consumption is leveled off at a very, very high level, one of the highest rates in the world, it's not growing very fast. Our meat production continues to grow as they chase these foreign markets. And so one of the things that means is that this sort of individual choice idea of, well, if I don't like the way meat production happens, I'll go vegetarian and that will solve the problem. It ends up not working out because that company is aggressively finding consumers elsewhere. The meat that you're not eating, they're having no trouble finding a market for it. And I think it really just sort of gets to the point of this problem is way beyond consumer choice. We need to organize political power to rein the industry in because individual consumption patterns aren't going to change it. And it also just kind of gets to the point of these companies, they need endless growth and they will do anything that they can to find it. And that includes dumping meat on foreign markets and putting farmers out there, they're out of business. Or aggressively trying to generate a taste for something that isn't in the culture. And I think a big example of that is milk. U.S. milk production is based on structural overproduction in the United States. We produce way, way too much milk. And it's a structural thing, and that really puts pressure on small dairy farmers in the United States. But so it's this export-based model. And so they go to places in Asia where there's no history of milk drinking, and really aggressively try to market it and get it into products and make it this, status symbol. And we're seeing that with milk all over the world.
It kind of reminds me of there was a period I believe in the 1980s when we had a surplus of milk and it was turned into cheese. That was really sticks well in my memory there.
Yeah, and that happens now, and so what happens is that you'll see campaigns like triple cheese pizza, or we put cheese in the crust of our pizza, not just on the top, and things like that, and that is the industry essentially getting cheese for free and finding a use for it because it is so cheap.
So obviously, a lot of these problems which you've described are quite unique to the U.S., but I was kind of curious if any of them are also appearing elsewhere across the world. Are any of these problems, are you seeing them anywhere else?
Yeah, I mean, I think, and I go into this in the book, and I think this would have interest to Manga Bay listeners, and that is that the system that the sort of handful of companies that preside over corn and soybean production in the Corn Belt of the United States are the exact same companies presiding over production in places like Brazil and Argentina and Ukraine. That situation now being greatly complicated by the war. But if you go to Brazil and Argentina, you'll see that Bayer, or I guess Bayer is how they call it in Germany, but the company that bought Monsanto a couple of years ago, dominant position in seeds and agrochemicals. the same meat companies. JBS, the Brazilian company that has, really strong presence in the U.S. market, it's the buyer of corn and soybeans to feed animals. And you're seeing basically what I think of as the sort of ace in the hole for global agribusiness, and that is the Brazilian savanna. The Cerrado of Brazil is being cut down and turned into corn and soybeans at an incredibly alarming rate. And we think about the Amazon rainforest, and as under pressure as it is from meat production, there is a global array of NGOs that are devoted to preserving it. Occasionally, like the current government of Brazil has an interest in preserving it, not the previous one. But there are forces, at least in array, that support it. Whereas the Cerrado, the Portuguese considered it a bad land, didn't care about it. Some U.S. agricultural technologists figured out the right chemicals needed to turn it into a place where you can grow corn and soybeans. And it has just now come under the plow at this a remarkable rate. There is loads and loads of carbon. It's maybe not comparable to the Amazon rainforest, but there are still massive amounts of carbon tied up in it that's being released. There's incredible biodiversity, and it's going under the plow for this. The same set of companies that are benefiting in the U.S. are benefiting there. The sort of meat complex of corn and soybeans supported by a set of pesticide seed providers, fertilizer providers, and then bought by a set of meat companies, turn it into meat. That system is very much a global system that the U.S. is just probably, the U.S. and Brazil are the two biggest nodes of, but it's the exact same companies. And I have thought about taking the argument in my book international and looking at Brazil and the Brazil, Argentina area, China as a major consumption hub, and just looking at the way that this set of companies totally benefits from this pattern of meat consumption, and just how destructive it is, and how incredibly how much it contributes to climate change through greenhouse gas emissions.
So, given the severity of this problem, obviously we don't have to cover the entire globe in this podcast, but what are some of the solutions then that you highlight in your book, germane to the United States? What can be done to correct this situation?
Yeah, so we've created this incredibly efficient and pretty simple system where, with this sort of geographical specialization, where we get fruit and vegetables and nuts from California, and we get meat and the raw material of meat, corn and soybeans from the Midwest, and it has produced this incredibly productive system where meat, relatively speaking, is really cheap. Our supermarket produce cases are full to brimming pretty much all year round. But like I said, it's consuming the very ecologies that support them. And I think the answer is basically diversification. It's as simple as that. So diversifying where we grow fruits and vegetables. California should remain a hub of fruit and vegetable production. Maybe the West Coast, maybe like sort of the main feeder of the Western U.S., but you could grow a lot more in the Corn Belt. You could actually, literally taking 1% of Corn Belt acres, something like that, some tiny percentage of Corn Belt acres, you could feed the entire Corn Belt provide the entire Corn Belt with fruits and vegetables. And I'm talking about cities like Chicago and Minneapolis as the metropolises in the Corn Belt. You could provide them with fruits and vegetables for the entire growing season. And, they have long cold winters there, but you can actually extend the growing season really sustainably with things like, greenhouses. You could make a point of doing low energy intensive greenhouses and extend the growing season. All up and down the East Coast, you could increase fruit and vegetable production. And I think it would take, we've seen, I make this point in the book that we've seen that happen all over the country. The local food movement has succeeded in creating farmers markets and CSAs and things like that have greatly increased the availability of local and regional fruits and vegetables. But it's gotten to, it's kind of stalled out at a pretty small percentage. And I think to get it above that percentage and really take pressure off of California to feed us, it's going to take policy. It's going to take state and localities saying, we need to support our farmers in various different ways to make it easier to get food to market, to provide incentives to get land into production. But it could be done. So diversifying that, and then within the Corn Belt, the Corn Belt, you can't, I think there's a naive idea that we could turn the Corn Belt into California. Well, 1% or so, a few percentage points of acreage switching over would be sufficient. And if you did a lot more than that, it would be disastrous. You would just way overproduce fruits and vegetables. You'd have all kinds of labor problems. It's a great place to grow grains and legumes. And so shifting over, first of all, shifting over to grains and legumes mainly for human consumption, and then diversifying to where you grow crops that basically overwinter, and so you have a significant amount of land covered every year. And I, go into the book about a farmer in Iowa named Tom Franzen, has been growing winter rye to great effect, where like at least a third of his land is covered every year. And it's not seeing anywhere near the erosion problems. The soil is basically stable because he has it, he has a significant amount of it covered. And then moving animals from the CAFO, from the sort of large confined operation back into the land. And that would also mean greatly reducing the number of animals. The land could not support the amount of hogs that are currently trapped in these factory farms in Iowa. But it could, let's say half of them could be moved to pastured production, where they graze, they sort of roam the land in rotation with other crops. It could be an incredibly productive system. So, something else that we know work well in that area at a proper scale are cattle, which are also in feedlots in that area. But it's simply diversification. And one thing I want to get across for Manga Bay folks is that when we think about the Corn Belt and the settling of the Corn Belt, which has also happened pretty contemporaneous with the settlement of California, 1850s, 1860s, we think of the destruction of the prairie. And the destruction of the prairie was a tragedy that we're still recovering from. It, evaporated massive amounts of carbon, all kinds of carbon stored in these sort of prairie grass ecosystems. But there was also significant deforestation. We don't think of the prairie as savanna, but much of that land was it was savanna. It was like sort of stands of trees growing next to rivers and things like that. It was also wetlands, huge. One of the things happening now in the Midwest and from the start of settlement is the draining of wetlands with tile, underground pipes to drain water out of these lands. But the deforestation there was massive. And one of the solutions would be agroforestry. Could do a significant amount of agroforestry, silvopasture in the Corn Belt. And it would be incredibly productive, and it would save soil, and it would store carbon at the same time. And there's a group called the Savannah Institute that is pushing that, but it remains in its infancy. It remains this sort of radical idea, but it really is a very, very natural idea.
You read my mind. That was actually my next question to you. Was about agroforestry and also agroecology, which as our audience is aware, we cover here quite a bit. So I was just kind of like curious to get your thoughts more about some of these techniques, like on-farm fertilizer production or seed saving, and how they can address multiple challenges such as like food insecurity to biodiversity loss and even climate change, which I believe that the 2022 IPCC report it reiterated. So I'm curious to kind of hear from you Do you think agroecology is applicable, like, to the industrial food model? Could it scale to potentially replace it?
I think that I think it's fundamentally at odds with the industrial food model, and um, I think that I think there are things you could do at the margin with the industrial food model that could improve things. But, agroecology is really about it, sort of local and community knowledge and local and community control. And I think it calls into question the whole US sort of settler colonial land owning sort of system where, I as sort of an economic actor go and purchase this 1,000-acre farm and I do whatever I want to do with it. I think that mentality is really at odds with agroecology, and I think that I think to to get agroecology rooted in the Corn Belt, what I think you're going to have to do is think about things like land reform and land back. These are things that I really support. And there's actually a bill by Senator Cory Booker that he introduced a couple of years ago called the Justice for Black Farmers Act. And one of the things it would do is it would put into place. Now, first of all, I should mention that it has zero chance of passing anytime soon, but we know in politics that things change fast. So maybe things will change into a place where it does have a chance of passing, but it would commit, I think, like $10 billion a year over 10 years to buying land and granting it to African American farmers. And I think that, got a lot of pushback when it first came. I mean, it was just rejected or ignored by industrial agriculture. It's just, that's not part of their language. But it got pushback in progressive circles because it didn't do anything to address the indigenous land claims. And I think they've gone back to the drawing board, and I think they're planning to produce a bill that would include indigenous people in these kinds of programs and other people of color. But I think getting land, and then I think that the ideal would be that such land would pass over and be communally owned, like new ownership structures that aren't sort of one land baron owning it. I think you have a real shot at agroecology taking hold in the United States. I think there's an important distinction between territories that have been under a settler colonial kind of land structure, like the United States, and territories that have been farmed by, like, in an old sort of peasant system. Places like Mexico, where there actually was collectivization of land ownership after the revolution. Even places like Europe, where there are peasants there are people who were peasants under sort of feudalism, and that system has, in some ways, maintained itself. I mean, the feudal lord has been, liquidated, but there is that style of land passed down over generations who are doing something besides just making money on the land, and settler colonial societies. And I think that settler colonial societies have a lot to answer for, and we have to just sort of figure out a solution to that problem to get agroecology. But I think in terms of like techniques for reviving that land and ending these problems, I think agroecology totally has the answer.
Great. It's really interesting to hear. So something I want to tack onto this is cover cropping for cornfields, which has kind of sort of generated a lot of buzz recently. Can you talk about what this is and what about it is beneficial?
Yeah, so it does answer some really fundamental questions. So it's basically, planting a crop after the harvest in the fall that is just there to cover the land. And, it could also be there to graze or things like that. And then, so what you're doing is you're taking the current system and saying, okay, everything can keep going as it is, but we're putting this Band-Aid on it. You have to cover crop. And I think that Band-Aid actually would have a lot of positive effects if it were really done correctly and you had the land covered over the winter. You would buffer soil from these, really harsh winter storms and preserve a lot of soil that way. I think in practice, I have farmed before, not in the Midwest. Practically speaking, getting cover crops in at the right time and getting them established is really difficult. It takes a lot of effort. There are parts of the Corn Belt where, especially in the northern part, where, by the time the harvest hits, winter's coming really fast. It's really hard to get a stand established before winter of something like, basically hairy vetch and rye are the big ones. And I think that in those places, this farmer who I feature in the book, Tom Franson, that's what he says. He says he can't really do cover crops. He's in way northern Iowa. And so, he thinks there needs to be another crop that is, a third crop in the rotation. And I guess what I would say about cover crops is I think they're great, but they're not going to make up for the duopoly of corn and soybeans. We still have to break that duopoly. And if we could get a third or fourth crop in the rotation and then have cover crops added to that system, now you're talking about a pretty robust system. And the other thing is that we've been supporting cover crops for, the U.S. government and various state governments have been really supporting cover crops for longer than the last few years, like 10 or 15 years, really strong support. And in a place like Iowa, they cover, after all the support, 3, maybe 4% of cropland in the winter. And so all the incentives have still not convinced farmers to actually use them. So I think we should look at them as a solution skeptically, but they do have important benefits, but they're not a be all end all.
So, I want to talk a little bit about the biodiversity crisis and how that fits into here. So, as we know, today there's a general decline in biodiversity everywhere, and the mass extinction of many species or potentially many species. But there's research that shows that things like perennial crops, like fruit and nut bearing trees and shrubs, can actually help boost the biodiversity when they're planted in agroforestry systems. So I was kind of curious to hear from you about your take on this. Do you see hope or promise in this system to help combat the biodiversity loss? And if so, is there like an example that you want to point to that like really stands out?
Yeah, I mean, I would say that agroforestry absolutely gives me hope. Since I actually published the book in 2020 and the paperback came out in 2022. And, since that time, I've been looking at alternatives to viable alternatives. I did a lot of my book, but I kept on because it's, such an important topic. And agroforestry is one of the most hopeful because, we do need to produce a lot of food. There's a lot of us on the planet. There's, a lot of us in this country. And it turns out to be this really productive ecosystem that provides room and space and habitat for lots and lots of different animals. And I just, I just want to give a plug to diversity in general. Like this guy, I'm going to get a little bit off of agroforestry here for a second, but this farm I visited in Iowa in 2019 when I was writing my book, I was in the very last bit of reporting for the book, and I went on this reporting trip to Iowa, and they had this spring and summer that was absolutely disastrous. So it starts to rain and snow in about March or April that year, and you get, really hard rain hitting snow-packed ground, melting the snow, and then just pummeling ground. There were just incredible soil erosion throughout the Corn Belt. And I got this tour from this Iowa State University scientist who was just showing me around the countryside. And we were just looking at these gashes in the land that were just where soil had just wiped out and just left fields and gone into creeks and taken all these agrochemicals with them. You know, I didn't even mention this interview, but there's huge water pollution problems throughout the Corn Belt. And it was really depressing. It was sort of like this post-apocalyptic ecology that I was looking at. And, you know, you start to get apocalyptic thoughts like, when are we going to have, you know, crop failures and famine? And, you know, these are the thoughts that I'm thinking of while I'm on this trip. And then I got this interview with this farmer in northern Iowa named Tom Franzen, and I go up to his farm and I'm just passing, you know, once again, I learned how to like read a field in Iowa from the soil scientists, and I'm just seeing unspeakable soil erosion. And I'm seeing these parts of the field. You know, he taught me that when you're looking at a bare field, like in May or June, that, you know, it was that time of year and planting was delayed because of floods and stuff like that. When you see black, that's beautiful, perfect topsoil. When you see gray and like light brown, that's subsoil. Like that is land where the topsoil is gone from. And I was just seeing that everywhere. And I was just like, okay, where are we going with this? So I go to Tom Franzen's farm, and he's got this incredible stand of winter rye, this bright green coming through. He's got hogs and some cattle on pasture. That I think they were like grazing in, you know, the previous year's cornfield and eating the stubble and things like that. And he was just talking about how his, you know, stand of about maybe 1,000 acres of rye, about just all of the birds that he was, you know, it was like, I'm gonna harvest in a few weeks, because then the birds will have, you know, hatched their young and will be leaving their nests, and I'll feel okay about harvesting this winter rye. And I was just thinking about how productive, how that ecosystem just supported all of these different species, not just, you know, more varieties of birds than we can even think about, but just all sorts of flora and fauna, and how it had just been just destroyed by the settler colonial agriculture that has taken root there. And just sort of the benefits of diversification and the benefits of sort of going to an agriculture that mimics the way that an ecosystem has evolved to function. It's just really smart. And in the Midwest, it just turns out that very much so, you know, putting in stands of trees in a agroforestry situation, in a diversified situation, not mimicking the almond farms of California, which are actually an ecological catastrophe, but doing it in such a way that that a variety of things are happening at once, a variety of crops are growing, can produce a lot of food and a lot more healthy food than we're getting now, and also just provide habitat for a bunch of species that are under severe pressure, and their crash is contributing to this biodiversity crash that we're seeing. So we could, you know, we don't have to have an agriculture that consumes the very ecologies that make it possible and leads to this catastrophic loss of species that we're in the middle of right now.
And on that note, is there any place in the U.S. where you think like that's the next place to do agroforestry? That right there, there's a lot of potential right there.
Well, I mean, I think the Corn Belt is the part that really comes to mind, because it's so foreign right now. It's such a radical idea right now, but it's also such a, you know, no-brainer of an idea. But I just, you know, basically anywhere in the U.S. where you've got communities coming together and thinking communally about land, I think are the ones that have the greatest potential. And really, another article I did since my book came out was I did an article on a budding movement of mostly, but not all, young folks to reclaim sort of a sense of Black agrarianism, which has been completely degraded in this country by the institution of slavery and sharecropping. But there's this movement of younger Black folks and older Black folks too, figuring out how to address the massive dispossession of land that Black farmers have gone through in the last century, and how to, reclaim a sense of Black agrarianism. And, what I found in my piece that published in Mother Jones, I think in 2020, or maybe early 2021, was that where that is happening the most effectively, which happened, mostly in the American South, but not just in the South, ideas of community ownership of land, of communal ownership, of working together, not in competition and not, churning out cash crops, but figuring out what ecologies work for land and, growing food for community resilience and community health. Those are the places that I think are the most hopeful that I've seen recently. And, I focus on a farm project in Durham, North Carolina, but there are lots and lots of projects like that. And I think that the thing that I find most hopeful about those projects is that they're not only rethinking the way that the ecology of farming and creating a more robust ecology for farming, but they're also getting directly at this ownership issue that I think is sort of fundamental to our agricultural problems. This idea of land ownership being, one person having title for the land and making all the decisions and taking on all the risk. That I think is central to our problems. And projects like this one I looked at in Durham are the solution. They're figuring out new forms of land ownership. And I got to say, they're under severe pressure because of the way our system works. There's lots and lots of big money rushing into farming. Bill Gates is famously the biggest farmland owner in the United States. Several sort of retirement funds and hedge funds are rushing in. And this is absolutely counter to this movement of people rethinking ownership. It's a way of sort of doubling and tripling and quadrupling down on the settler colonial idea of agriculture. And the farmland that they have will be managed in such a way to, basically maximize their profits. And that's what got us into this dilemma in the first place.
So you've mentioned a lot of things that have sort of given you hope. And so I was wondering if you could elaborate any more on what else gives you hope that we can fix not just the U.S. problems with agriculture, but perhaps the global ones.
Boy, that's a tough one. But I just think, a lot of times people ask me about, what technologies do I think are transformative, and what agricultural technologies I think are really going to change things and disrupt things. And, my answer to that is always that the only real killer app, as they used to say in the tech world, is solidarity. And I think the only hope that I see is that the progressive movement in the United States, and I mean that broadly, that we become more internationalist, that we look at things more globally than we do now. I feel like we share a border with Mexico, but Mexican politics are rarely discussed in the United States. The Mexican economic situation, political situation, even though our countries are so bound together, even though our farm labor relies so heavily on Mexican people doing it, we don't think very globally as a progressive movement. And I think that generally speaking, and also with food production, making ties globally, U.S., I would like to see the Black farmer movement in the United States forge ties with and open communication with the peasant agricultural movement in Mexico, which is actually very strong and always under pressure from, the forces of global capitalism and things like that. And I think where I see that happening does give me the most hope. And I think that's where I would leave it, is just, nurturing and working on a sense of solidarity with other people who are on the wrong sides of these forces of ecological destruction.
And Do you have any more thoughts that you would like to share about global issues such as the invasion of Ukraine or climate change and how these have challenged food production and things to monitor as these situations evolve?
Yeah, I mean, in terms of the invasion of Ukraine and the ongoing war between the Russia is, sort of this war of conquest that Russia is putting on Ukraine. One of the things that it keeps making me think about is that we're in a place in history where things are extremely unpredictable. Like if you had asked people a year before that invasion whether there would be a full-scale Russian invasion of Ukraine that would, risk getting NATO involved, getting the U.S. involved, and essentially a war between two nuclear powers, which is, I think, it's where we've been since the war started, and it's not gotten any better. I think that wouldn't seem like a possibility. And yet it happened, and it happened in a region that is really kind of the global fulcrum of the wheat trade, the sort of Black Sea, basically Russian and Ukrainian wheat production. The war is happening in that very region. Sort of Eastern Russia is where Russia's wheat production. I'm sorry, Western Russia and the border, the sort of Ukraine area border. And then Ukraine are this massive center of wheat production. And then that wheat goes out to the world through the Black Sea into the Mediterranean, goes to places in Africa and Asia. And it has created this, it has added fuel to an already simmering global food crisis. And, having global food production so industrialized and so based on trade, and so based on this idea of comparative advantage, where let the sort of Black Sea region, Russia and Ukraine, handle wheat production, and we'll do corn and soybean production in the U.S. heartland and in South America, and we'll just have these California will be the center of global nut production. Having it so geographically concentrated just leaves it open to these shocks that seem like they're not going to, seem impossible, like this war. And climate change just makes it more and more fragile. And we've already seen countries completely seen their economies collapse, like Sri Lanka. I did a piece on Sri Lanka, I think it was in 2022, about how the collapse of that country was popularly blamed on organic agriculture. And that was ridiculous. The collapse of that country was based on just unsustainable debt levels and just being tied into this global system of agriculture. So I think it's sort of like my answer to my book. We need to diversify. We need to build up ecologically minded food production everywhere in the world, and have trade as something that happens at the margin. But it isn't sort of the basis of a society getting food. And, we're seeing in the Horn of Africa, climate change related droughts, and terrible economic policy has placed those countries in a position of being dependent on wheat from the Black Sea region, and they are suffering dramatically from it. And that's what we have to get away from. And just as we have to plan for a world of increasing shocks by increasing our resiliency, by investing in sort of ecologically conscious and, where possible, just agroecological food production just everywhere as a response to this sort of hyper globalized food system.
All right, Tom, before you go, we know that you recently accepted a research role at Johns Hopkins Center for a Livable Future. Do you care to share with us about anything you're studying or working on there?
Yeah, right now I'm working on doing some research for possible articles on the situation in Eastern North Carolina. So Eastern North Carolina is sort of ground zero for U.S. hog production. There are a lot of Iowa is devoted to hog production, these giant factory farms, and it's the number one state in hog production. North Carolina is number two, and almost all of that hog production is in a few counties in the east that are the most heavily African American rural counties in the state. If you looked at a map of the density of enslaved populations in 1860 and the density of African American rural populations in 1930 and African American rural populations today, and you overlay, they would all be pretty much the same. And then if you overlaid the density of these hog farms, they are right in these African American areas. And it's an example of environmental racism. And the pollution of water and air there is happening on a scale that is unbelievable. I saw and have pictures of literal pipes coming out of fields drenched in hog shit, and pipes coming out of the field, drainage pipes, and dumping hog shit into creeks. I've talked to people who live near what they call spray fields, who can't leave their houses when they're spraying. It stinks year round when they're not spraying because the lingering smell. And also they live near what is called a hog lagoon, which is essentially an open cesspit. And this is happening in a country with a Clean Air Act and a Clean Water Act. And so, it's just an incredible example of deregulation and industry control of a political system and environmental racism, like at a level. I mean, I knew it had existed. This is my first real visit there, and I just, found it just jaw dropping. So I'll be working on a couple of articles out of that here in the next couple of months.
Well, I'll keep an eye out for him. Tom, thank you so much for joining me and speaking with me about your book. It's been a great conversation.
All right. Thank you so much for having me.
If you want to read Tom's book, please check out the link listed in the show notes. If you enjoy the Mongabay Newscast, we ask that you help spread the word by telling a friend. It really is the best way to help expand our reach and keep growing. You can also support us by becoming a monthly sponsor via our Patreon page at patreon.com/Mongabay. We are a nonprofit news outlet, and even just $1 per month will really help us offset the production costs and hosting fees. So if you're a fan of our audio reports from Nature's Frontline, head to patreon.com/Mongabay to learn more and support the Mongabay Newscast. That's patreon.com/Mongabay. You and your friends can join the listeners who have downloaded the Mongabay Newscast over 500,000 times by subscribing to this podcast wherever you get your podcasts from, or you can download our app for Apple and Android devices. Just search either App Store for the Mongabay Newscast app to gain fingertip access to new shows and all of our previous episodes. And you can always read our news and inspiration from Nature's Frontline at mongabay.com, or if you prefer to keep up with us on social media, give us a follow at facebook.com/Mongabay or on Twitter, Instagram, TikTok, and also Mastodon. Our handle is @Mongabay on all platforms. And don't forget to check out our video reporting on YouTube at Mongabay TV. Thanks so much for listening.